Now, the South African economy experienced its worst economic period in decades this year after the impact of COVID-19 accelerated the country's recession to deeper levels and plunged global markets into turmoil. Now, since the beginning of the year on a decline, the onslaught of COVID-19 pushed South Africa's gross domestic product to a downturn never seen before as economic activity stalled. Now, as a result, South Africa has forecast to record its lowest GDP growth in 90 years this year, as the economy is expected to decline by at least 7.2%. Economist Duma Gqubule joins us now to take us through some of South Africa's biggest economic moments of 2020. Duma, good evening, and thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Hi, Thabo, how are you?
I'm well, man, and I hope you're well too, and staying safe and distant in this time of the second wave of this pandemic in South Africa.
Yes, of course. It's a real disappointment what's happening, and yeah, but we'll talk about that some other time.
Let's talk about the economy. I mean, when March 26 hit, we were not in a good place to start with, but I suppose COVID-19 became the biggest economic story the world over.
Yes. Now, I like talking about the crisis before, what the Communist Party calls the crisis before the crisis. So the crisis before the crisis, I talk about 26 years of mismanagement of the economy. Between 1994 and 2019, our economy grew by only 28% in per capita terms. That is 1% a year over 26 years. Now, if you look at the last decade, we had what I call a lost decade in terms of economic development, where our economy in per capita terms per person did not grow for 10 years. And in the last 5 years, between 2014 and 2019, we had 5 consecutive years of declining GDP per capita, where South Africans on average were getting poorer. Now, as we're heading towards COVID, we had 2 recessions in 2 consecutive years, 2018 and 2019. And we were heading on 27th March, as you said, towards a 3rd recession in 3 years. Now, what has happened over the past 10 years before COVID is that unemployment soared by about 5.8 million people to now we're talking about 11.3 million people. So we've had, this year, as you said, our economy will collapse by the worst in 1 century. So in per capita terms, it will decline by about 9%. When you look back at the end of the year, on average, we'll be only 15% richer than we were in 1994. And I think it's time to have a proper discussion about the economic policies that we've been pursuing for the past 26 years and the inadequate response to this once-in-a-century pandemic and economic recession. Because if you look at what happened, if we look back over the past, we had an unprecedented freeze in stock markets in about March. And then we had the response from the government was always lagging the scale of the crisis.
Now, let's talk about then exactly that in terms of policy and what needs to change and what we need to do. But let's start at our state-owned enterprises. I mean, as we are talking now, there are talks of a new airline in whatever shape or form, whether it's going to be partly owned by the state, partly owned by private individuals, and whatever it is going to look like. But that particular airline, when we were starting the year, was really on a verge of collapse as far as it was in a business rescue process. And we had been waiting for that business rescue plan. We were expecting it around December in 2019, but it didn't come. Even around March, it had still not come.
Thabo, you know, I prefer to stay out of the SAA debate because it generates so much heat and it doesn't really have a macroeconomic policy impact. The numbers that we're talking, it's about 10 billion rands or 15 billion rands, and that is not a lot of money in the context of a 5 trillion rand economy. So the state-owned enterprises that matter, that have macroeconomic impact, it is Eskom and Transnet. They account for about 80% of government infrastructure investment. So if we have to get this economy going, the first thing, the president talked about a recovery plan, but the biggest reason for the collapse of the economy over the investment over the past 5 years has been an investment strike by the public sector, primarily central government, Eskom, and so forth, and Transnet. So we can't have a recovery plan if we're not addressing why the government has been the main factor in terms of the declining investment in our economy.
Let's talk about then the Eskom debt of 463 billion rand. Will there be any reform without addressing that debt?
Now, you see, so many people over the past, it's now 3 years since we had this new board at Eskom. We've had so many panels and celebrity commissions and giving recommendations to the government as to how to reduce the Eskom debt. Now, the Eskom debt is about 480 billion rands. It needs to be cut to about 200 billion rands. There are so many proposals that are on the table. I do not for the life of me understand why the government hasn't taken action on this one. Because, and remember, just before the lockdown, COSATU put forward a very serious proposal in terms of using the PIC to address the issue of the Eskom debt. And many other people have put forward many other proposals as to how we can reduce this debt of Eskom, because there is no recovery in our economy unless we sort out this Eskom thing. I think it's a crisis. We have an Eskom debt crisis, but I don't think we have a national sovereign debt crisis as well.
The employment stimulus plan by President Cyril Ramaphosa of 2020, how is that going to work? I mean, in terms of the numbers of jobs that is going to create, it doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the unemployment crisis that we have in the country.
You know, I've been doing an analysis for COSATU on this matter. And, you know, the funny thing is that they're going to create 300,000 jobs in the schools at 300 assistants. So it's 3,500 rands a month. But if you look what the Treasury has proposed, they're proposing, I've been engaging with them the last few days, unprecedented cuts in government spending, about 310 billion over the next 3 years. Now, when I look at these numbers, I think that there will be massive job cuts, and there's no way to achieve these unprecedented cuts without massive job cuts. My estimate is about 400,000 job cuts, and many of them will be teachers, nurses, and so forth. Now, you're employing teacher assistants on the one hand, and then you're cutting workers and teachers on the other hand. I don't see the logic of that here. And so you're trying to create an employment stimulus while you're reducing employment in the public sector by about 300,000 or 400,000 people. Yeah, it just makes no sense whatsoever. Yeah.
I suppose the hope is that there will be enough stimulus in the economy for the private sector to absorb those jobs.
No, that's the main thing. The president announced a stimulus on 21st October and 21st April, and Treasury on the 24th of June cancelled the stimulus. Now, the stimulus was supposed to be 500 billion rands, but if you unpack the stimulus, 200 billion rand was the loan guarantee scheme, but the banks have only lent 17 billion rands out of the 200 billion they were supposed to lend. What has happened is that they've used the state guarantee to shift loans towards prime clients. 75% of them were white businesses, as the small business minister said. So I am not counting that as part of the stimulus, because those people would have got the loans in any case, COVID or no COVID. Then the government response in terms of the budget was 36 billion rand increase in non-interest expenditure. And then the other component of the stimulus was 50 billion rands for them from the UIF. So the stimulus was only 86 billion, not 500 billion, and that is only 1.7% of GDP. Now, the mantra of global stimulus packages is that they must be equal to the expected shock to the economy. The expected shock to the economy was about 8 to 9% according to most forecasts, and the stimulus on the other side is only 1.7% of GDP. You saw the unprecedented stimulus packages, countries throughout the world pumped $12 trillion into the world economy, and the US now has announced another 900 billion pumping into their economy. Developing countries, they started printing money, about 18 developing countries, Ghana, Guatemala, Indonesia, and many countries started, and their central banks were supporting their economies, but we haven't seen that level of support for the economy from the central bank in South Africa or the National Treasury.
Talk about the unlocking of the 1 trillion rand in infrastructure programs over the next 4 years and whether that will have any impact.
Well, the government hasn't told us how they will fund this increase in infrastructure. They're almost wanting to have the they want this infrastructure to happen, but they're not prepared to put money into the program. You can't have an infrastructure plan, as I said, when government is reducing its investments drastically in the economy. The government has to commit more resources to the economy. And there is no way out of this crisis, Thabo, without new money injected into the economy. I would say because of the immediate humanitarian crisis, we have to agree on a massive stimulus for our economy. Half of it must be spent on infrastructure that creates jobs, and half of it must be provided in income support to households. The saddest thing that I've seen throughout this crisis is the millions of South Africans who are queuing for that 350 Rand grant, the SRD grant. It is demeaning to the dignity of black and white South Africans who are in these queues, and they have to wait for many hours to get this SRD grant. Now, the millions of people who went through all the bureaucratic obstacles towards accessing this grant is proof that we need a basic income grant as well.
That basic income grant conversation is one that is also left hanging. In fact, we do know that the special dispensation grant for COVID-19 is coming to an end in January.
Yes, there's a lot of, I think there's been a sort of agreement that we need to have some kind of grant, and I've participated in a number of meetings with the government and NEDLAC and so forth as to how we should implement. So there are various many, but I think we have to have some kind of, there's an immediate humanitarian crisis, and we cannot create jobs fast enough to address the humanitarian crisis. So people who say we all agree that we need jobs, but even the jobs will take time to be created. So in the meantime, we have to increase our social support, the basic income grant to millions of South Africans. Yeah.
Duma, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Founding Director of the Center of Economic Development and Transformation, Duma Gqubule, looking at the year that was economically.